The components that make up an agent are, to me, three things. It's what is the orchestration, what is the tools, and what is the memory capability, right? And if you think about a human, we have a very similar mechanism. Our orchestration is our brain, right? Like it's the model in the case of the agent that gives it that ability to dynamically and flexibly think about what the right step is, but it cannot work in the environment and cannot take signals if it doesn't have tools. Similar to humans, if we cannot take signals through our eyes or cannot operate with our hands, we can just orchestrate in our head, but we cannot execute and get feedback, right? So
your first instinct might be to do some front-end agent, like your chatbot that is talking to your customers. Maybe consider looking at your back office and maybe consider starting your use cases there. And that kind of jives with what the MIT study is saying too, that maybe you should consider more back office workflows to automate.
we talked a lot about test-driven development in the last couple of decades, and I think with AI, we really need to embody a culture of evaluation-driven AI development. Agent governance, you should have some commandments, right? Like you have kind of culture best practices or a rule book for your employees. Like in the same way for your agents, you should have a governance rule book. And to be honest, like it doesn't have to be super complicated. I think I have this list of like 5 commandments I sometimes talk to leaders about. I think we need a similar mechanism for agents to go to sleep or, some periodic learning to come back and say, oh yeah, like great conversation yesterday, Jawad. I understand you better. Let me adjust how I approach this particular. I feel personally that yes, AI is overhyped, but at the same time, we are in the midst of a pretty big platform shift. You will need a front of your business that is an agent that can surface some of these information and maybe even take actions, right? Like, hey, book me a flight, but if there's 2 different flight providers and one of them doesn't have an agent and I'm using an agent, like instead of my agent trying to figure it out through the API or the website, it'll just call the other company's agent, and suddenly like that's the SEO of the new world. When you have an economy of agents, you need 2 things. You need the ability of agents to interoperate with each other because everyone has a specialization and you don't want to build that specialization in-house. You want to work with that partner with that specialization. So you need this ability to do peer-to-peer communication and know what others' specializations are and then collaborate. And that's where A2A comes in. A2A is this peer-to-peer protocol for agents to communicate with each other, advertise their capabilities, understand others' capabilities, and then figure out how to work with each other in an authenticated, compliant manner.
Welcome to GovAI.fm, your no-nonsense guide to AI in the public sector. Connect with peers and learn from real successes, failures, and lessons from the trenches.
So today's guest is Jawad Amin. Jawad is with Microsoft, previously with Apple, and an alum of University of Waterloo. And when I was asking people from Microsoft or consulting people, who is the go-to person? I want to talk about AI agents and who is the go-to person? And his name comes up right away. I've followed Jawad's commentary on social media, on LinkedIn, different places. And what stands out is how he cuts through the clutter, bringing clarity to the space that's often filled with hype. And that's exactly what I wanted to do in this episode. I think he's truly an important voice in AI and autonomy and AI agents. So I'm really excited about this conversation. Welcome, Jawad.
Yeah, thank you, Girish. Thank you for the opportunity and thank you for having me. Just by the way of intros, I'm Jawad. I lead AI architecture, particularly for financial services, and slowly branching out to a few other sectors like public sector, retail. And my focus and area of expertise is around Gen AI and agents. Before this, I did run the AI capability at Slalom. And prior to that, I did hardware and ML research at Apple for a little bit.
That is cool. Yeah. Any other points how your story led you to where you are, if you want to expand on any of it.
Yeah, totally. So I have a maybe non-traditional or interesting background
Okay.
to get to AI. I wanted to be an analog circuit designer. I did electrical engineering, and I had the privilege of working on some of the products that Apple was working on in the late 2010s, including Watch. I was part of the autonomous cars program, so I was really close to a lot of the machine learning, computer vision work that was happening at that time. And when I joined Apple full time, I joined a research team, as part of which I was doing a lot of hardware work, but I was also looking at ML for battery optimization, for healthcare signal classification. So it's a very roundabout way of looking at hardware problems and thinking about, could ML help solve some of these problems? Particularly on signal classification, things can be noisy, so ML is a great approach. Ironically, I felt like ML was still very niche at that time, so I wanted to move away from niche researchy things and do things that help customers. And so I took a hard pivot into consulting and big data and spent a couple years really working on data and some ML ops. And then with Gen AI now being at the forefront, it felt like the right time to get into Gen AI. And, that started with when GPT-2, GPT-3 came out, and started experimenting. The models were good, but they're not as good to today. Like now, I feel like we're going through essentially a platform shift all over again.
I used to ask this question about, there are 5 people in a room. One is cooking, one is doing this, one is doing that, one is playing ping pong, and the fifth one, I don't say anything. And then I ask, what is the fifth one doing? And then till GPT-2, 3, 4, it got it wrong. And then O1 said, number 4 is playing ping pong. So 5 must be playing ping pong with him because it's a 2 people game. And I was like, aha, like it reached some point here, right? Like, so also the applied part on having this itch to do more applied work than the research work, and things that you can see the changes right away. And that is very relevant to our audience here. So our audience are people who are trying to make AI work for use cases, back office use cases, chatbots, all sorts of things in a public sector. So maybe getting a little more about you, what questions in the field keep you up, like get you excited? Like, are there any problems you're trying to solve that you're thinking about?
Yeah. I was actually having a conversation with a colleague today where, you could point me to anything. And if you prodded me enough, like I would get curious and kind of try to spend a lot of time in a rabbit hole. But I think in terms of like the field itself, I'm really excited about voice. I think voice has a lot of opportunity. For the last like 20, 30, 40 years, like we have very much used text as the primary medium for office communication, for doing work, for communicating on the internet. I think with socials, there's a lot of images, but still the communication channel is primarily through text. There's a lot of one-way communication, but for bidirectional, it's usually text. I think with voice, there's a lot of opportunity. And with, some of the recent announcements, even things like GPT real time, I think there's both an opportunity to really reimagine how we interact in terms of having personal assistants that are voice enabled, tools that are voice enabled, calling into helplines that are voice enabled, and ability to tap into healthcare data to give you nursing advice. But there's also risks, because the way we have solved for voice and the reason we have been successful feels very much because it's so human-like, but then that brings with it a whole set of risks. And how do you do signatures for AI bots versus, what is a human voice? I think that's going to be interesting. I think that's one big area. The other area is I'm really interested in continuous learning. I've been spending a lot of time thinking about it. I think, agents are very static in nature. You program them, you let them go, but they're not learning and adapting from their environment. I sometimes use this analogy with customers that humans are like agents, but we get to sleep at night and we process new information. And when we wake up, hopefully we have a better understanding of the world. I think we need a similar mechanism for agents to go to sleep, or, some
Wow.
periodic learning to come back and say, oh yeah, like great conversation yesterday, Jawad. I understand you better. Let me adjust how I approach this particular. So I think that that's
So agent going to school or university, like something like that.
yeah. Like I think like just the idea of like not having agents that are built once statically and then never adjusting. And to be honest, like I actually think a lot of that framework exists already, like with continuous fine tuning, with a lot of the memory capabilities that we have now. I think it just hasn't been democratized as a platform capability where people can like I use this analogy of like plugging your Tesla into the charger, you plug in your agent to the fine tuning framework, you come back the next day and has learned a few more things.
Okay, so very good tidbits and insights. So having like what gets Jawad excited is making the agents are already dynamic and autonomous, but making them continuously better. And even within that dynamicness, maybe at some point they are static, they only do what they are programmed to do. And what if that continuously gets better? Then they are even more like humans because we continue to learn. So yeah, pretty cool. So going back, maybe for our audience, some of the audience have heard about AI agents. They have heard that 2025 is the year of the agents. They have heard that Mark Benioff comes in from Salesforce and he says that half of my staff, like half of my work, can be done by agents. And then he's saying we can have humans as some people answering his calls, agents as the other people. They're hearing that. They're hearing coding agents. So earlier where we could like copy paste our code and say fix this, now we almost have Zuckerberg talking about maybe some of the agents are like software developers. So I'll have a team of some developer humans and developer agents kind of a thing. So people are hearing about like agents in these aspects. Maybe we can start by defining agents, like in simple terms, what makes something an agent and how is it different than a chatbot or an automated script or a cognitive workflow?
Yeah, great question. And I think there's a lot of definitions floating around in terms of what an agent is. The way I like to ground myself in the definition of an agent is by defining the individual components, what make up an agent. And I always talk about those components and try to articulate how different platforms, whether that's Microsoft, whether that's OpenAI, they're thinking about those components and progressing those components because that's ultimately what will make agents stronger. Like I think at a 10,000 feet view, agents are capabilities or tools or systems that have agency. And what I mean by agency is given a set of input criteria or an environment or a circumstance, they can have the agency to decide what is the next best action, right? Like really at the core of that is what defines an agent. So when I think about deterministic workflows where you're embedding AI, to me, like that's not necessarily an agent because you are defining what the workflow execution steps should look like and you're embedding AI, which again, by the way, I think everything gets labeled as an agent. That's that's not necessary, right? Like sometimes you want that workflow. And if you think about, okay, so if an agent is something that can dynamically make decisions, like how can it achieve that? So the components that make up an agent are, to me, three things. It's what is the orchestration, what is the tools, and what is the memory capability, right? And if you think about a human, we have a very similar mechanism. Our orchestration is our brain, right? Like it's the model in the case of the agent that gives it that ability to dynamically and flexibly think about what the right step is, but it cannot work in the environment and cannot take signals if it doesn't have tools. Similar to humans, if we cannot take signals through our eyes or cannot operate with our hands, we can just orchestrate in our head, but we cannot execute and get feedback, right? So, and that tool's ability is really important to marry with the orchestration. And then lastly, you need a layer that keeps state, right? Because if I just orchestrate and if I call tools, but I can't over time remember what I'm doing, then I essentially have amnesia. And like, that is a condition that you see even with humans where, hey, like they're amazing at thinking about a problem, they have the tools, but for whatever reason, their memory capacity isn't there. So I think with agents, we also have that third component, which is memory, and that could be short term or long term. And if you think about things like continuous learning, as we talked about before, like you move towards more of this like long term memory, and you're seeing a lot of advancements moving from short term to long term memory space as well.
That's so beautiful. That is one of the best explanations of agents that I have heard. And many people I've heard, like Andrew Ng talks about agents as agenticness and patterns and all. But let me paraphrase what you said and tell me if I got it right. So the first step you said is orchestration, and that's the most important one. Where if there is some cognitive workflow where you say chatbot, you get a question. If the question is this, then go this direction, and then within this, if there is another detail needed, then go to this direction. If that is created by the developer of the chatbot, then it's not very agentic, because the flow of how it is going, that orchestration that you're talking about, is predefined, as opposed to a research agent, where you ask a general researchy question, and then the next step, the agent thinks of that, I think I need to do a Google search on this. And then it does a Google search. And then it says, let me look at some of the more recent publications, because this search pointed me to another. And then it is also defining how it is taking the next step and the next step, as opposed to the developer predefining it. So that is like your table stakes. That's the first definition of agent. And then what you said is that, but that orchestration is not enough, because if you have that orchestration capability, but if agents cannot do anything, like do is in this example searching the internet. So if they cannot search the internet, then they can orchestrate all they want, but they're not useful. They're not autonomous. So they can do things like both actions that they take and feedback that they receive. So that's the tools piece that you define. And then you said to do this orchestration and the tools, there is an underlying thing that you need, which connects the multiple steps and how they relate to each other. And that's why they're like, we kind of haven't said it, but we definitely need a memory, and that it keeps pointing to. And that's why you created this clear definition of agent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. You nailed it. And I think like once you have that definition, you can then define agenticness, right? There's a lot of, is it agentic enough? Like, and to me, that's like, okay, in the spectrum of static and dynamic orchestration, like where are you on that spectrum? Because, if it's fully dynamic orchestration, that works for generalized use cases, but may not work for, a mortgage processing application at a bank, right? So then maybe it's halfway agentic. And then the same way with tools, like then you can say, okay, like what type of tools am I using? Like, am I using knowledge tools like humans use their eyes and ears, or am I using action tools, my limbs or my voice, right? So then you can start having these more functional conversations around, okay, what do I need to build my agent, and what is it that I'm comfortable with?
Got it. Beautiful. That's excellent. So yeah, I think for our viewers, I hope it is very clear what the agents are and what agenticness is. And I think you also clarified that it's not that this dynamic workflow is cool and everybody should do that. There are use cases where Jawad is saying that actually workflow that is just predefined is better. And many times in businesses, there will be cases that it is better. There will be cases like the research agent that we spoke about where the dynamic is better, or it would be a hybrid. So he's just making the segregation between agents and not agents, and agents being dynamic, not making a judgment call that all your like agents are better in any aspect.
100%. Yeah, I think the best thing is whatever helps you drive the most business impact, right? Like I think, if you look at the recent like MIT report, if you look at some of the McKinsey work recently, like ultimately whatever we do with AI has to be grounded in what is the business process that we're trying to transform, and how does that then percolate to all of the systems that I need to interact with, and how much flexibility do I get in orchestration with those systems.
Beautiful. So now that we have piqued the interest of some of our listeners, maybe let's make it real. Maybe we'll give them some use cases. So what are some compelling use cases where we actually need this true autonomy that you've seen around, where this kind of standard flows are not cutting it, or we will get better business value if we have an agent?
Yeah, it's funny because I think you gave the example of research. I find research to be, I sometimes say like a lot of true agentic capabilities are going to be what are horizontal capabilities. And what I mean by that is like these are not very specific to a business domain, but they are something that all business domains can use. So research is a good example where I would probably want a dynamically orchestrated research agent that understands my intent, has a set of tools, whether that it's web search, whether it's writing some code, visualizing some reports, and then pulling all of that data, aggregating it together, and then maybe doing reasoning on top of that, using some of the reasoning model capabilities to formulate an insight or an opinion, right? And that pattern should be dynamically orchestrated. It has a collection of knowledge tools and action tools, and hopefully has a memory layer baked in. And you can reuse that in a variety of sectors, whether that's in healthcare research, whether that's in, wealth management, whether that's, in doing product market research for retail, right? Like you think about that horizontal agent capability and then you apply it to vertical domains. So research is one example. I think the other great example would be this idea of dynamically executing code. So maybe this is more of a vertical example, but I've been spending a lot of time working with customers, and it's also a personal interest of mine, which is, hey, like, how do you do, if you take something like retirement planning, which is very customized, very unique to you, depending on what your risk appetite is, what your product mix looks like, what is the income that you feel good about in retirement. Like, that's such a dynamic problem. Like, you cannot build a workflow that maybe it'll work for Girish, but it won't work for me, or it won't work for like a million customers. So that's an example where I want the model to dynamically orchestrate. Okay, I'm going to connect to some portfolios of funds. I'm going to look at Jawad's past data. I'm going to write some code, execute some code. And if Jawad comes tomorrow and says, you know what, like I had this change in my family situation, or I just quit my job, like, can you build a scenario for me? That's a very one-of-one scenario planning.
Got
Like,
it. Got it.
replicate that type of workflow. There's some like horizontal agents that I think you can reuse, like research is a good example. I think document processing, like paper forms, is a good example. But then there's also these like vertical use cases which are so personalized that I think dynamic orchestration would be the only way
Would
to
be
achieve
great.
them.
Yeah. So yeah, if you almost think of research more as a generic template, and now what the example you did is for your personal finance, you're doing kind of research, but now it's in the context of this personal finance or to achieve this specific goal. So there will be many such use cases, like each of the listeners and whatever problem they are solving, if they think about any individual use case and think of it as a research that you're doing, and you have multiple tools to do that research, then it can kind of apply to them.
Yeah, exactly. And like maybe like as we're on this topic, like there's a great paper or cookbook that came out of OpenAI last week where they talked about how to do better temporal agents for knowledge management. Or, in Microsoft, we sometimes talk about agentic search. And these are all kind of that same vein of thinking, which is, can I dynamically orchestrate, get a search query, break it down into subsets, run them in parallel, and then aggregate and generate a response? So I think that pattern is almost universal, whether you apply that to something generic like research or something very specific like retirement planning or aging research, and figuring out which molecular compounds are going to work the best, right? Like it kind of stretches the whole spectrum.
Same thing. Beautiful. Okay, I think that makes it much more real for me for sure, and hopefully for some of our listeners. Recently, I was hearing Harrison Chase with LangChain. LangChain is one of the popular frameworks that we use for LLM orchestrations. And he was talking about ambient agents. And he was saying that think of these agents not as synchronous like your chatbots, where you ask a question and you're immediately waiting for that answer, and then the answer comes right away. If we have this agenticness, then these are agents that can keep running in the background. Earlier, you mentioned they can keep learning, but they can even keep doing your research in the background. Maybe do you want to linger on this or have any inputs on this?
I think about that quite a bit, actually. So I feel personally that yes, AI is overhyped, but at the same time, we are in the midst of a pretty big platform shift. And, Google search in some ways forced a lot of analog companies and businesses to become digital because otherwise they weren't going to hit their SEO and they wouldn't be visible. And I think the same thing is going to happen where we will have this ecosystem of agents. And, like even taking the example of retirement planning. So if I have my agent that helps me do retirement planning, it is incentivized for the companies of the world that sell funds or do retirement services to talk to my agent asynchronously, provide inputs to my agent so that my agent can take some of their inputs and make a quality assessment, obviously, and then give me that data, right? So in that world, like this proactive way of a human going to a website, searching information, like that's just not going to be the case. Like I'm going to just say, hey, like I have this problem to my personal agent and say, okay, go figure it out. Go connect to the rest of the network of agents that you have and come back. So there's going to be a competition ecosystem, right? And to me, like that's what the ambient intelligence world looks like. You will need a front of your business that is an agent that can surface some of these information and maybe even take actions, right? Like, hey, book me a flight, but if there's two different flight providers and one of them doesn't have an agent and I'm using an agent, like instead of my agent trying to figure it out through the API or the website, it'll just call the other company's agent. And suddenly, like, that's the SEO of the new world that you're optimizing. And
Wow.
to me, like, that's the ambient kind of intelligence coming over the next few years.
Wonderful. Love it. MIT report you mentioned, and MIT report for the viewers is fantastic work and was very recent. Had work from January to June when MIT group Project Nanda did some surveys, like a lot of surveys. That was a highlight. 95% of LLMs and Gen AI applications were not working, and many details to it. And there's a lot of things you can learn from it. So without going into details, there is a lot of agentic use cases that are falling short currently, or at least that's the perception. So where are agents in the current state falling short, and where are they starting to deliver value?
Yeah, great question. I think, if I continue using my framework around orchestration, tools, and memory, right? I think it's a combination of the readiness as well as capability gap, where today I think we see a lot of maybe narrow slice agents working, but not broad swath agents, unless you talk about things like researcher and analyst and Copilot or, ChatGPT agent for browser automation. Like those, I think, are doing well. In terms of if you think about orchestration, I think the models are getting a lot better at following instructions, staying on intent, and calling tools correctly. And as the models get better, like even between 4.0, when we were using 4.0 for agents versus 4.1, drastic improvement, because 4.1 is much better at following instructions. So I think like you're going to see that orchestration capability continue to get better. And it's a little bit different from like that chat way of interacting. Like it's more like tool calling properly, following intent. In terms of tool calls, I think a lot of the reason, if you go into the MIT report, like a lot of the agents are not fully integrated into the business workflows. And they called it out as one of the biggest reasons that Gen AI is failing in general. And that's because like a lot of these systems aren't designed for agentic interaction. A lot of these systems aren't even designed for API interaction, right? So I think now that there's an incentive for the world to kind of build better APIs, build better MCP servers, and almost a competitive landscape like an SEO optimization for agents, I think that tools layer is going to get better. You're going to have more connectivity, and being able to interoperate is going to be really important. Like I have my tools, you have your tools. How can we have an open ecosystem of collaboration? Lastly, memory. I think, I don't remember the exact statistic, but it was something like the last generation of OpenAI models could only do like 5 minutes of long running tasks before they were failing or they were too brittle. Says I think now I think it's a few hours, if not days, right? So there's a lot of work happening on making that context window richer, making memory systems better. So I think that's gonna lead to more productionization of agents.
I see. So what you're saying is, in your framework of the having orchestration, having the tools, and having the tools and the memory make it happen. The orchestration successful, and you're saying as the tools get better and we have more connections, and as the memory get better, and that's done by the providers, we will see that our table stake capabilities itself will keep growing for everyone.
Yeah, and models will get better for the orchestration layer. The like even as between 402, 4.1 to 5.
Oh yeah, you mentioned that too.
Like I think there's a lot of that orchestration is just going to become more and more fine tuned and be able to follow instructions better.
So that the reasoning model part of the piece is getting better, and that is helping with orchestration. So all three steps are getting better, and we can see already, right? For the 4.1, you gave an example. They are going to get better. So yeah, the future is bright. So for people who are excited and they're saying, wow, I'm in public sector, I want to create a minimum viable agent. Like I want some ideas. Like what can I work on? You already mentioned some, but did you want to give some advice, tips on, get started on this?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, look, there's definitely a shortage of human capacity, particularly in a lot of back office operations. And that's true regardless of which industry you're in. And, I'm based out of Toronto, Canadian, right? So when you look at the Canadian government services and healthcare ecosystem, like you can feel a lot of that back office challenges, right? And I empathize with people who are in the front lines supporting Canadians day to day. And I think there's a lot of potential for agents there, whether that's agents working in the background to collect knowledge, to process cases, to summarize data, and giving and freeing up cognitive headspace for humans so that they can focus on things that matter, all the way to almost this straight through idea of, hey, like this one doesn't actually require human intervention. It could go straight through, and then humans can focus on the more important and exception cases, right? So if you think about back office, there's tremendous opportunity in knowledge management, frontline, case processing, documents. And then as you look more towards customer facing, I think voice is going to become important, right? Like, how do we serve more people, have a broader outreach, have broader education and connectivity with the citizens of your locality or your country through voice interactions, through more empathetic helplines, and so on and so forth.
Beautiful. So for the viewers here, if you're thinking like, I want to develop an agent, I want to get my hands dirty on an agent, one, go for it, do it. It's getting better. And Jawad is saying that your first instinct might be to do some front-end agent, like your chatbot that is talking to your customers. Maybe consider looking at your back office, and maybe consider starting your use cases there. And that kind of jives with what the MIT study is saying too, that maybe we should consider more back office workflows to automate. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I think just anecdotally, we have had lots of success with back office because those are the spaces where, the outcomes are measurable, right? Like the humans who are doing that work, they have an SLA, they have a quality standard. So agents love those things, right? Like when you have clear guidelines, clear metrics, like that's the perfect place to build an agent. So we even within Microsoft have had a lot of success with those types of more defined problems versus maybe directly in frontline where, the risk and uncertainty is slightly higher.
Totally agree. Okay, in the next section, we wanted to talk about the governance and the guardrails and taming the agents. We talked about orchestration being dynamic and that being a benefit because it can do many more things that a developer hasn't even thought of. But every benefit also has an equal and opposite downside. And in this case, the orchestration being dynamic would also mean that there are more risks. So the question, and for public sector leaders, they deeply care about transparency and dependability. So how do you ensure that the AI agents are predictable and safe?
Yeah, I sometimes say, agent governance you should have some commandments, right? Like you have kind of culture best practices or a rule book for your employees. Like in the same way for your agents, you should have a governance rule book. And to be honest, like it doesn't have to be super complicated. I think I have this list of like 5 commandments I sometimes talk to leaders about, and it's, your agent should have an identity and it should have a chain of accountability, right? That's number one. So if it has an identity, I know what it's doing when it's accessing data. I know which agent it is. When it's talking to other agents, I know what its capabilities are. And some of these are getting baked into protocols like A2A, right? So A2A has an agent card which tells other agents and humans what that agent's capabilities are and what its authentication protocol is and so on and so forth. So I think that's like the first layer. Like you need that agent identity and chain of accountability. Like who owns that agent? If something goes wrong, which team owns that agent? Which organization owns that agent? The number 2 piece is, are we building agents in a standardized way, right? So if I'm giving prompt instructions, if I'm connecting tools, how am I doing that in a way that we can then have CI/CD policies kick in and say, oh, like you gave this agent instructions to go access the customer database and review all records. I think we should review that. That feels like a high risk thing, right? So when you're building agents as leaders, you have to enable a great developer experience for your teams, but you also need to have an automated policy check engine that says, hey, like these agents shouldn't be allowed. I think the third one is having a tools registry or a tools marketplace that's centrally governed. And MCP is like a
It's great
amazing.
to have that. Yeah.
Yeah. So now with remote MCP servers, like you can have a governed tool registry similar to your API catalog, very goals oriented. So you know which tools your agents can connect to and what the authentication mechanism should be.
Perfect.
And then the last 2 are really like run, right? Like day 2 run and operations type of things. Is my agent logging every interaction it has? Is it communicating all the tool calls is it making? Yeah. What data does it have access to? And then the 5th layer is, for agents, human in the loop is going to be really hard. So I have 10,000 agents running around. Like I can review all of these logs in the 4th commandment with a human.
Mhm.
Like it's not
Yeah.
gonna. So
Yeah.
that how can we have governance agents or risk agents that are running
Mm.
in day 2 monitoring and raising flags, raising alerts, right? And that's kind of that 5th pillar that you need. So you kind of stitch that together to say, okay, I'm going to let my organization build agents, but I'm going to have these guardrails of identity, of policy, of continuous monitoring, of tools registries to make sure they're not, escaping a boundary that I don't want them to.
I love these 5 commandments. It almost feels like that Isaac Asimov's commandments, and they are so comprehensive. Like I had prepared like a bunch of questions about governance and how to tame agents on technical levers, non-technical levers, human in the loop. You covered it all with these 5 commandments, so that's pretty cool.
Thank you. Yeah.
So for public sector leaders who are evaluating agents, like, do you have any framework? Like, these are the things to start with to get better success, like starting with a low cost of error use cases or bounded scope scenarios. Like, how do I pick the right use case?
Yeah, I think that is very much organization dependent. I run a little COE within Microsoft Canada to help our internal teams, make the right bets on AI, choose the right use cases. And I think the biggest learning is sometimes don't start with a narrow use case, start with a business process, right? Like look at a business process like back office case operations and think about the steps in that journey. Like, how are we doing case intake? How are we doing case routing? How are we doing data extraction? How are we doing decisioning? How are we communicating back to, whoever raised the case? And then how are we resolving that case, right? So if you think about like those 5 or 6 steps, each one of them could be a use case. But if you think about the business process as a whole, then you're able to rethink and say, okay, you know what? Like intake and data extraction and routing can happen in one breath. And then maybe the reasoning happens before we communicate back to the user to figure out like, okay, is this an exception scenario or is this something I can just process directly? And if it is an exception scenario, should we route it through a human for review before we communicate back to the case owner, or should we do something else? So I think that mindset shift from moving from slices of use cases to business process will help. And then the side benefit of that is most of our leaders, business leaders, are incentivized by their business process. So if I am a customer success leader, I'm incentivized by
My current KPIs. Yeah.
exactly, like how
Yeah.
quickly am I resolving the cases in my business
Yeah.
process, or how am I reducing the volumes of cases? So then suddenly, like your AI initiative is grounded in real business metrics and impact that you can measure. And honestly, sounds simple, but I think sometimes simplicity is the best. Like start where the business is, what their business process is, and then work backwards to say, how would an AI first process look like? And then that will give you your roadmap for success.
That's wonderful. That's a very original, counterintuitive advice that I've heard here. And that's what I was hoping will come out of this conversation. So, for listeners, like many times we are told that take a very small slice of a use case. And what Jawad is saying is actually think of the business process, and there might be multiple slices, and you might be able to think of them differently. Start from first principles and an agentic kind of workflows that might make more sense. So, pretty cool.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Yeah, so we are close to the end. So, wanted a lightning round, things that come to your mind. What are some of the biggest misconceptions in agents in specific or generally in AI?
Yeah, I think some of the biggest misconceptions is that, AI is a 0 or 100, right? So if a model hallucinates, I can't use it at all. Or if a model is good, it's good under all circumstances. So I think really, like, we talked a lot about test-driven development in the last couple of decades. And I think with AI, we really need to embody a culture of evaluation driven AI development, right? So what am I trying to evaluate? Let's set those criteria first before we build, because it is not a 0 or 100, and the edge of capability is very jagged. So you want to form your own opinions around where you sit on that edge of capability, and then having an automated way to measure that edge every 3 months or 6 months as you get new models.
That's beautiful. There's so many things I feel like I want to double click on and on what you said. So maybe I'll start with, earlier you mentioned A to A, and many of the listeners are not familiar with that. So maybe do you want to explain that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. I think I set a little bit of the groundwork by saying, we are going to have an economy of agents, similar to how we had a digital economy, which was very much focused on SEO and websites. We're going to have an economy of agents. So when you have an economy of agents, you need two things. You need the ability of agents to interoperate with each other, because everyone has a specialization and you don't want to build that specialization in-house. You want to work with that, partner with that specialization. So you need this ability to do peer-to-peer communication and know what others' specializations are and then collaborate. And that's where A2A comes in, right? Like A2A is this peer-to-peer protocol for agents to communicate with each other, advertise their capabilities, understand others' capabilities, and then figure out how to work with each other in an authenticated, compliant manner.
Got it. So for the listeners, you would be hearing more about A to A or agent to agent in the coming days. One of the things that reminds me is in 2002, when I was doing my master's work, multi-agent systems was the thing there, and it was not cool at all. Even AI was not cool. Forget about multi-agent systems. And one of the canonical example that we were given to solve was like there are children on the field, and you're asked to make them in a circle. And these children think of them as individual agents. And then there are two ways to solve this. So one is actually you say number of children divided by like 360 and then identify where each person goes. So it's central command and control way of doing that. And then put each child on the field. Or second is actually make those individual children autonomous and give them only one rule. And in this case, the rule was look at the person on your left, look at the person on your right, and you come in between them. That's it. Like if you're slightly on this curve, pick one step here. And each person, each individual child, it just has that one rule that look on the left, look on the right, and just come in between them, automatically a circle is formed. Like you don't need to have complex rules about 360 and this and that. Like you don't need to do that. So many times humans do that too, right? Like we have some very simple rules that we follow, and we make very complex things like economy and democracy and like all these things that are just emergent behaviors that come out of these simple rules, right? So that was one of the things that stuck to me when you were talking about it. And what you're saying is A2A is just a way for these agents to communicate, to publish what they do, what they can do, and interoperate.
Yeah, exactly. And I love your example because in your example, you had a very defined rule set, right? And the beauty of AI with this new wave of AI is that the rule set doesn't have to be so rigid, right? So it's flexible. And I think that is the opportunity. So if each agent is so flexible and then they can collaborate, then you can have a lot of flexible emergent capabilities that come out of that collaboration.
Beautiful. Perfect. Okay, this is a fun question. Any overhyped agent demo that you've seen that you want to share about?
Yeah, I think honestly, like I love every agent demo. Like I feel like the potential of the technology is so much. Like I really tried to think about, hey, like what would be an overhyped agent? But I think the challenge is taking a demo and making it real. And that's where, so they're actually all appropriately hyped at the demo stage. It's just
I
that
like that.
as you get into the reality of the messiness of the world that's designed for humans, that's where I think a lot of these are kind of falling face first.
Beautiful. Okay, maybe the last question. If our listeners want to keep updated on AI agents or AI in general, or want to know more about things, any books, any podcasts, any other sources of information that you recommend?
Oh, yeah, tons. I think I love, in terms of podcasts, listen to yours. I've listened to a few episodes. They're amazing. You know, I would encourage like Dwarkesh,
Yeah.
Patel does an amazing podcast. I try to
Amazing.
catch him quite a bit. I think there's a new podcast, Cheeky Pint, which is
Seen that.
I forget. It's one of the
The
founders
CEO of one of the,
Stripe. Yeah,
Stripe. Yeah, right.
yeah, I believe so. Like, which is great. I think in terms of just content, like the OpenAI cookbook is incredible. Like they publish really good guides. The Microsoft blogs are amazing. Yuna Arenas, who's our VP of Foundry, she has been doing a 6-part series on agents, and every part in that series has been really insightful. Yeah, I think those are some resources.
That's beautiful. And one resource that I will add is please follow Jawad. I have been following him and I'm having a fantastic time. The level of clarity that he brings, even some of the things that he mentioned today are just fascinating. So it was lovely chatting with you, Jawad. Thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
This was govai.fm. Connect with us on LinkedIn, suggest a guest, and stay tuned for real stories from AI in action.